Debe Atrops was 30 years old. She was a young mother.
I didn't get to have my mom growing up. It was this mystery that has never been solved.
Rihanna.
My name is Rihanna, and I am referred to in the story as the baby.
Riri.
The 8-month-old baby who lost her mom.
Yeah.
So you believe on November 29th, 1988, this was the last known location where she probably came.
We believe that she drove alone on this very rural road, and that was the last drive that she took alive. The car is found on December 1st.
I knew she was strangled and she was found in her trunk. There was just so much unknown. Who did this? Why did this happen?
We focused pretty early on Robert.
Handsome.
Like me?
Bob Atrops was married to Debe Atrops. They've been married for a year or so, and they were struggling, having issues in their relationship, which caused them to separate.
We continued to conduct additional interviews, follow up on various leads, and then it went dead. It was a tragedy. There were times when I wondered if we would ever make an arrest.
Finally getting answers nearly 35 years later, as prosecutors say now 68-year-old Robert Elmer Atrops is the person responsible for the November 1988 murder of his estranged wife, Deborah Lee Atrops.
I was just in shock. I couldn't believe it. They 1000% got it wrong.
The motive evidence is very, very strong. Debe Atrops had a new romantic relationship with a man named John Pearson. They worked together. She was excited about it, but she was very concerned about Robert Atrops finding out about her relationship with John Pearson.
The husband is often the obvious suspect. However, Debe Atrops had a complicated life and kept a lot of secrets.
We view this as a case of actual innocence.
There is more evidence that suggests John Pearson was involved in Deborah Atrops' murder than there is Bob Atrops.
They thoroughly interviewed John Pearson. Things were good between him and Debe Atrops. He had no motive to commit this crime.
John Pearson did have motive to kill Debe Atrops. He said that in hindsight, he thinks that Debe Atrops was only with him because she was looking for somebody to pay the bills for her. That's plenty motive.
Hello, Rihanna Lynn.
My dad did not do this. I know my dad. I know his heart. And I know that he'd never be able to live with himself doing that.
It was Thursday, December 1st, 1988, when Deborah Atrops, known as Debbie, was found murdered in her car next to a construction site here in Beaverton, Oregon. Debbie had been reported missing 2 days earlier by her estranged husband, Bob Atrops, who lived about 5 miles away on this rural road.
So where are we in relation to the Atrops case?
Right here is Southwest Conzelman Road in Sherwood, and this is where Bob Atrops was living at the time of Debbie's murder.
On the night she went missing, Bob says Debbie, who was then 30 years old, never arrived to pick up their baby Rihanna as expected.
I think that it's important for everyone to know that just because a case goes unsolved doesn't mean that it's forgotten.
Allison Brown is a senior deputy district attorney in Washington County, Oregon.
Here's our exhibit list.
Who, along with attorney Chris Luman, joined a team of investigators working on Debbie's unsolved murder. Brown says they hope talking to the original detectives, witnesses,
We've got videos, this is from the scene,
and looking at the evidence again,
phone calls from 1988.
might give the old investigation new momentum.
There were opportunities for forensic analysis that were not available in 1988.
Debe Atrops was last seen alive on Tuesday, November 29, 1988. Bob Atrops called the Tigard, Oregon police that night at 9:40 p.m.
This is Tiger Police. Can I help you?
My wife was running about 3 hours overdue from a hair appointment. I was getting a little concerned. She lives in Sherwood.
Okay, what's her name?
Deborah Atrops.
Okay, and what kind of vehicle would she have been driving?
It'd be a black Honda Accord.
Bob told the dispatcher Debbie hadn't shown up after an appointment in Tigard, about 8 miles from his house, at a hair salon called Razzmatazz.
Called, rang about 20 times.
It would probably be easier for you to make a run down her path to, how she would go than it would be for us.
Bob says he drove the route and saw no sign of Debbie. He called Tigard police back at 10:25 p.m.
Why don't we give it about another hour, and if you haven't heard anything, give me a call back.
Bob did call back a third time at 11:29 p.m.
Yeah, this is Bob Atrops again. Have you heard anything?
No, and the guys have gone out. It's real foggy out, but they have checked around the area. Did you go to Razzmatazz and see if her car was there at all?
I did. But there's no car.
There's no friends or anything she might have gone to visit?
Checked. All everyone to think of.
But the one call Bob did not make that night was to Debbie.
Okay, sir. We have checked around the Sherwood area, and we can't find her car at all.
The dispatcher suggested Bob call the Washington County Sheriff, which he did at 11:34 p.m., and they opened a missing persons case the next morning. But Debe Atrops would not be a missing person for long.
Even though I've been retired for years, it still kind of hung over me.
Washington County Sheriff's Detective Michael O'Connell remembers responding to the scene when Debbie's car was found. The license plates had been taken off. The window was open, and the keys were inside. O'Connell's partner called Bob Atrops.
You being the husband, we need permission. We'd like to search the car, and like know if that'd be all right with you.
Sure.
A few minutes later, police found Debbie's body, face down in the trunk.
She was nicely dressed, still had her coat on, looked like she'd been placed somewhat carefully in the trunk.
Police say Debbie had been strangled, and there were no signs of sexual assault. There was mud on her coat and shoes, the front passenger tire, and the steering wheel of the car. Law enforcement scoured her vehicle for evidence.
It looked like someone may have tried to wipe down the hood. There were like broad clothing swipes, like someone maybe was trying to destroy fingerprints.
O'Connell and his partner went to Bob's house to tell him they had found his wife's body. A witness who saw Bob later that day told the cold case team he was very calm, much more calm than I would expect.
It wasn't consistent with a grieving, estranged husband.
Debbie's stepfather, Ed Holland, says her mother, Gloria, who was close to Debbie, was overwhelmed with grief.
She broke down, and I held her, and that's all I could do. She just laid there sobbing.
Police searched outside Bob's home for any further clues.
The driveway was a mix of mud, dirt, and gravel, and it looked like her car may have driven through some of the mud.
Bob had said Debbie was last there about a week before her murder. Police took photos of the tire tracks outside his house and collected soil from his driveway and lawn.
Just to make sure we weren't missing anything.
Police never found any tire tracks that matched Debbie's car on Bob's property. Yet Bob Atrops was an obvious suspect. But he wasn't the only man in Debbie's life. Since she had moved out 5 months before, Debbie had been dating, and those relationships were complicated.
Debbie had very good taste and was a good judge of people, but a terrible judge of men. Every man that she seemed to hook up with was a problem.
So you're always sort of by his side, right?
Always. It was great growing up with my dad. He was an amazing dad.
Your little girl, did you get this?
Do you have memories of him being hands-on?
Yeah, my dad was very hands-on. I knew that I was his number one.
And thank you for being the nicest daddy there could ever be.
I remember being at my grandpa's house with my cousin, going through old photo albums and finding a picture of this woman. And I was like, who's that? And she just kind of was like, that's your mom. From that point on, I always remember knowing the story.
Debe Atrops' daughter, Rihanna Stevens, says she learned about her mother's murder when she was 6 or 7 years old. She says growing up, her dad only shared fond memories of her mom.
I didn't know that they had separated. Anything that I had ever heard about her was always good from him.
But things were not always good in Bob and Debbie's marriage. Debbie's stepfather, Ed Holland, remembers meeting Bob, a construction product salesman, and talking to Debbie's mother about how quickly Bob and Debbie walked down the aisle.
They were still in a courtship when they got married. I said to Gloria, I said, this is way too fast. She says, well, if they're in love, why not?
Debbie's friend, Darlene Lufkin, says, like Ed, she was not confident the relationship had a strong foundation.
How long did they know each other?
Just a few months, it seems like. It takes time to get to know someone, and I don't think she really knew Bob yet.
Bob and Debbie got married in June 1987 and adopted Rihanna the following March.
Hello, Rihanna Lynn.
Because of conflicts in their marriage, just a few months after bringing Rihanna home, Debbie moved into her own apartment in Salem, 30 miles away from Bob. Investigators say Debbie had soon reconnected with an old boyfriend, Jeff Freeberg.
You said he was the one for her, perhaps.
That's the one she kept wanting to go back to. She really, really liked him, and I don't think he was just ready for that kind of relationship yet.
By September 1988, Debbie had a new boyfriend, a man she met at work named John Pearson. John was separated from his wife and had 2 young boys.
But I remember she was on the phone at my house once with him. She handed me the phone, and he said how much she was looking forward to meeting me and the girls. When Debbie was seeing people, for some reason, she wanted them to meet me and my girls.
Darlene says she and Debbie had grown close in their 20s when Darlene was a single mom.
She's really the only friend I had that enjoyed spending time with my daughters, and I treasured that.
In that autumn of 1988, although Debbie was dating John, she stayed in touch with Jeff Freeberg, and he loaned Debbie $8,000.
He had lent her money to buy a car. Could there have been motive in that?
He was wealthy, so I think he was happy to help Debbie.
Back in 1988, detectives had asked Freeberg for his alibi on the night Debbie was last seen alive. And he said he was home, except for going out briefly to get some dinner.
He seemed very straightforward, didn't hesitate to answer our questions, didn't seem to be hiding anything.
Police had also questioned John Pearson, who said he was with his children and his estranged wife that night. Pearson knew about Debbie's hair appointment and gave detectives a detailed description of many items inside her car.
John Pearson told police back then that there was a Burger King bag, as well as a box with cranberries and a child car seat. It seems like a lot of details about the car.
Pearson also said there wasn't enough room in the trunk for a body, and that stuff would have to be taken out. But Detective O'Connell says Pearson had seemed truthful back in 1988.
It was mostly accessible. Didn't appear to be trying to throw us off or anything.
And prosecutors Chris Luman and Allison Brown say there's an innocent reason John Pearson knew so much about Debbie's car.
They were seeing each other every day. I mean, something to look into for sure, which is why they did multiple interviews of John Pearson and a polygraph in 1988.
And did he pass the polygraph?
He did. And he was willing to do it and basically do everything that they asked him to do.
Bob Atrops hired a lawyer a week after Debbie's body was found and declined to take a polygraph. Detective O'Connell says Bob did not seem very worried about finding out who killed his wife.
He was kind of removed, just kind of distant.
O'Connell and his partner looked into the calls Bob said he made the night Debbie went missing.
There's no friends or anything she might have gone to visit? Check. All everyone that you think of.
Bob told detectives he called the babysitter, Debbie's boss, and her parents while he was home waiting for her. They all confirmed he did call them that night, but there was a hitch. Those 3 calls were long distance and should have shown up on his phone bill.
That was a problem. Those phone calls were not there.
By now, detectives suspected Bob had killed Debbie. They thought there was no record of those 3 phone calls because Bob was out of the house that evening, disposing of Debbie's car and her body. Police began looking for evidence Bob made those calls from somewhere else.
It involved checking payphones. We looked at every angle. We struck out.
They did not find proof that Bob was lying or evidence connecting him to Debbie's murder.
I didn't like the thought of it just remaining unsolved.
O'Connell and his partner had a final meeting with Bob in 1990, asking him to account for those missing calls or to admit he had killed his wife. But Bob maintained his innocence.
And then it kind of went dead.
When the cold case team next interviewed Bob in 2022, they asked again about those phone calls and heard a very different story.
I'll be honest with you, Bob. Your story that you're telling us today is significantly different than what you told investigators back in the day. And so my question is, what really did happen?
We spent a lot of time together. We took the girls to the beach. Went to music in the park with picnic dinners.
It's been more than 30 years since Darlene Lufkin last saw her friend Debe Atrops, but she says she still feels the loss.
It sounds like you have really fond memories of Debbie.
Yeah. I miss her every day still.
Darlene, like many in Debbie's life, longed for answers. And in 2022, she got one step closer. When the cold case team sent Debbie's coat and those soil samples for testing.
The soil was sent to the FBI lab, the DNA was sent.
While they waited, the cold case team continued to examine Bob's behavior back in 1988, which prosecutors say was suspicious from that first call.
He calls law enforcement within, probably 20 minutes of calling the friends and family. And to us, that seemed a little quick. So we believe he was attempting to get his story out there and to portray himself as a concerned husband and try to develop that narrative that he wanted to early on.
Detective O'Connell says he had the same feeling. Remember, Bob had called police 4 times that night.
What's the Shakespeare quote? He protests too much. It was interesting to us that he was calling so frequently and so soon. It didn't seem normal.
The cold case team also turned their attention to the road where Debbie's car was found, next to that construction site. Bob's former boss at Allied Building Products told them he believed Bob had a connection there.
He was selling roofing products. I knew that he was selling products in that area.
In 2022, the results from those DNA tests came back. The lab said they found a mixture of DNA on the collar and shoulder of Debbie's coat.
They swapped that area of her coat because if you're strangled, that would be the area you'd have contact with.
The lab compared that sample from Debbie's coat to her boyfriend at the time, John Pearson.
It's not present.
And neither was her ex-boyfriend, Jeff Freeberg.
Jeff Freeberg, not present.
But the lab said Bob Atrops could not be excluded as a contributor to that DNA mixture.
We can't say it's a match, it's moderate support that it's more likely Mr. Atrops than an unknown individual.
Prosecutors admit while the DNA from Debbie's coat excludes Freeberg and Pearson, it does not make a complete case against Bob Atrops.
I think it's another piece. There are many, many different pieces. It was a very fact-intensive case.
Another one of those pieces, they say, is the mud.
This murder was connected to mud. Her body was covered in mud. There was mud on the outside of the car, on the inside of the car.
The FBI lab, which examined this evidence, concluded that the mud on Debbie's car tire did not match the mud where her car was found. However, that mud on the tire, they said, was indistinguishable from the mud from Bob's lawn in color, composition, and texture. This is evidence, prosecutors say, that Bob was lying when he said Debbie did not come to his house the night she went missing.
According to the defendant's interview, she had not been to his house for about 10 days.
Bob Atrops hadn't spoken to police about the case since that final conversation with detectives in 1990. But in 2022, he agreed to talk to the cold case team.
It is October 19, 2022. Here with Bob Atrops.
Investigators asked Bob about those calls to friends and family that didn't appear on his phone bill back in 1988.
You made those phone calls from your house?
Yes.
Using your home phone?
With an MCI card?
No.
Yes.
No.
Bob now said he had used an MCI calling card to make those missing long-distance calls from home.
Yeah, an MCI card from Allied Building Products.
That is not what you told investigators. And you said, I made those calls from my home phone using my home long distance.
But you dial in and you punch in the code and then you can complete the long distance.
Prosecutors say Bob didn't have that MCI calling card in 1988. And what's more, prosecutor Chris Luman says this story doesn't make sense.
In 1988, to make a calling card, you had to input about a 16-digit calling card number and then another 6 or 8-digit code. And if you're frantically looking for your wife, why take the time to do that and enter all those numbers?
In 2023, prosecutors brought the case to a grand jury who voted to indict.
I got a phone call on March 2nd of 2023 at 5 o'clock in the morning that my dad had just been arrested. I was just in shock.
Rihanna says Bob is a loving dad and doting grandfather to her 3 children.
What was it like seeing your dad front page story?
It was awful to see the news making him out to be this terrible person that he just isn't. He didn't do this.
Cold case detectives spoke to Bob Atrops again after his arrest.
My opinion is you've told yourself a story for the last 34 years, and you've told yourself the story over and over and over again to the point that it's become the truth for you. It doesn't make it true, but it makes it easier for you to tell that story.
I don't believe that, but okay.
What part don't you believe?
A story that I created, I guess.
You don't believe that you created a story?
No.
Okay. You're just are not in a position to acknowledge that you played a role in her death.
No, I did not.
Bob Atrops pleaded not guilty to Debbie's murder. Attorney April Yates argues it's more likely Debbie's killer was her boyfriend at the time, John Pearson, than Bob.
John Pearson not only had motive, he had opportunity. He knew where Debe Atrops was going to be. He knew about her hair appointment. And also, he knew an incredible amount of detail about her car.
But prosecutors say Pearson had nothing to do with Debbie's murder. Back in 1988, he told police that about a week before the murder, Bob confronted Debbie because he was suspicious she was in a new relationship. Pearson said Debbie was afraid if Bob found out it was true, he would kill her. The prosecution planned to call Pearson as a witness in Bob Atrops' upcoming trial.
We wanted to have him testify because we found him credible.
But that would never happen. Pearson, who had been ill and had an outstanding warrant for a DUI in Oregon, stopped responding to detectives. When authorities located him in Arizona, 5 days before opening arguments were to begin, John Pearson killed himself.
John Pearson fled the state. He was on the run.
Attorney Janice Purcell was part of the defense team.
Police find him in a trailer in the desert in Arizona. When police surround that trailer, he ends his life rather than coming back to Oregon to answer questions about Debe Atrops' murder. Those are the facts. Prosecution can spin it all they want, but those are the facts.
I'm trying to be strong for my dad.
In spring 2025, Robert Atrops' murder trial began here at the Washington County Courthouse. Prosecutors worried the jury might get stuck on details they could not explain.
In a case where we need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, we're not going to be able to answer every single detail of what happened that night. Remember, the appointment's supposed to end around 7:15. By 9:40 p.m., he's calling 911.
At the trial, which allowed audio but not video recording of witnesses, attorney Allison Brown argues that Bob Atrops intentionally misled the police, starting with those 4 calls he made to them the night Debbie was last seen alive.
He didn't tell the law enforcement officials that they were separated, that they lived separately. So he didn't actually give them the information that they would need to find her.
Bob didn't tell police Debbie lived in Salem until the next day. Even more incriminating, prosecutors say, is the fact that Bob Atrops did not call Debbie the night she went missing, or ever.
He never called her apartment.
That would have been the first phone call, right? Someone hasn't showed up, you're expecting them, you call them. Not only was that not the first phone call, but he never made that phone call at all.
When asked about his route... At trial, prosecutors played Bob's interview with investigators in 2022, where he explained why he didn't ever make that call.
Did you ever call Debbie's place?
Her house? No. I didn't even consider that as an option.
So let me rephrase, and correct me if I'm right. You never considered calling the place she lives?
Not when she was supposed to be in our vicinity, no.
Prosecutors also want the jury to hear more about the troubles in Bob and Debbie's marriage. Debbie's friend Christy Knapp testified to an encounter with Bob at his house soon after Debbie moved out.
We went there to get some serving dishes. We walked into the entry and he just started freaking out and screaming. He seemed really, really tall and really scary. It was terrifying.
Another friend, Tammy Nelson, told police in 1988 Debbie had confided in her that Bob Atrops had choked her in a violent confrontation shortly before she moved out. Tammy told the jury Debbie was still worried about Bob after their separation.
What did she say she was concerned about?
Well, she was concerned that he'd kill her. I thought she was teasing to begin with, she was being dramatic.
Yeah.
And so I turned around and I looked at her and I saw that she was genuinely scared.
Tammy had also told police in 1988 that a few months before her murder, Debbie was worried about Bob finding out about her relationship with John Pearson. Tammy later told the cold case team Debbie had said, "If anything happens to me, Bob did it."
Debbie is predicting her own murder. She is telling friends and family, if he finds out about this, he will kill me. And she was right.
But in their cross-examinations, the defense suggests these stories Debbie told are not reliable, and they say Debbie had a history of making up false tales.
She had told different stories to different people, and these things were verifiably not true.
Some of Debbie's friends say she did tell questionable stories, often about her health. Darlene says she thought Debbie might have done it for attention.
One time she said that she went to work out, her stomach flipped or something, and she had to go get emergency help with it. It didn't seem real to me.
And there's a very simple...
Attorney April Yates says there is a simple explanation for why Bob Atrops didn't call Debbie that night. He had spoken to her stepfather, Ed Holland.
Ed told Bob that he had been by Debbie's apartment and she wasn't home. There was no reason for Bob to call. And the next morning, Debbie's parents went to her apartment again, as did law enforcement. So there was no reason for Bob to call or go there. The fact that the state is trying to make something out of that, it's a red herring.
During trial, the babysitter and Debbie's stepfather testified that Bob had called them the night Debbie went missing, which supports Bob's story. Attorney Stephanie Poland says the best explanation for why those so-called missing calls weren't on his phone bill is that the billing equipment was faulty.
We found the engineer and he testified that this equipment failed all the time.
But the cold case team believes Bob made those calls while he was out of the house getting rid of evidence to help him create a false alibi. And they say it was impossible to check every payphone in the area back in 1988.
What was significant is he's not where he said he was. He's not at home. Why would he lie about where he was that night?
While the state emphasized the link between the mud on Debbie's tire and the soil from Bob Atrops' front yard, the defense says that this soil is everywhere in the region and is as common as dirt.
This soil is everywhere. My yard, her yard, the DA's yard. It doesn't make us suspects in a murder.
Back in 1988, police didn't collect mud from Jeff Freeberg's property or John Pearson's. They only took samples from where Debbie's car was found and from Bob Atrops' driveway and lawn. Then there was the matter of the DNA from Debbie's coat.
The DNA in this case doesn't tell the jury anything about who killed Debe Atrops.
Attorney Yates points out that the amount of DNA on Debbie's coat that the lab had said could be consistent with Bob Atrops was minuscule, the equivalent of about 6 skin cells.
And this very low level of DNA is consistent with something called transfer DNA. People who have babies in shared custody transfer DNA all the time.
So in your opinion, this DNA was not strong evidence?
This DNA was not only not strong evidence, it doesn't mean anything.
The defense argues there is a much more important DNA result from Debbie's autopsy.
One of the very first items that the lab tested for DNA were vaginal swabs taken from the autopsy.
Attorney Janice Purcell specializes in evidence that can lead to wrongful convictions. She says the DNA from Debbie's autopsy does not point to Bob Atrops.
The semen came from John Pearson, and the likelihood ratio is 94.6 sextillion. It's an enormous number.
And she points out Pearson's DNA at autopsy contradicts his statement to police from 2022.
John Pearson told law enforcement that he did not have sexual contact with Debe Atrops in the 72 hours before she was murdered, and definitely not on the day that she was murdered. But they found that semen 2 days later at the autopsy. Everything is telling us that that was most likely deposited on the day that she was murdered.
And the defense reminds the jury John Pearson was avoiding the cold case team in the months leading up to his suicide. In its closing statement, the defense says the state just doesn't have enough to make its case against Bob Atrops. But prosecutors argue all of the pieces point in one direction, to Bob Atrops.
Like you hear, motive, means, and opportunity. He had it all.
Now, after 2 weeks of testimony, It is time for the jury to decide.
We didn't know if that would be enough or not. It's incredibly nerve-wracking.
What did you think before the jury left to go deliberate? Did you feel confident?
I didn't feel confident. Because of the fear of the unknown. I don't feel like any evidence was actually given that proves my dad did this, because there is no evidence that he did this.
On April 17th, 2025, the jury reached a decision.
It was 6 hours that they were deliberating. We thought that that was a quick verdict and that could be a good thing.
My understanding, the jury has a verdict in this case, is that correct?
Correct.
To the charge of murder in the second degree, the jury has found the defendant guilty.
Guilty. 37 years after her death, Robert Atrops was found guilty of murdering Debe Atrops.
It was like the room went dead silent, and everything was still in that moment.
We all crumbled. We are grieving someone that is still alive.
Were you able to say anything to your father in that moment, right after?
No,
Hug him, nothing.
I haven't been able to hug my dad in over 2 years.
We had so many family and friends of Bob behind us. It was really hard for them, especially, to see this happen to their loved one.
I could see it's hard for you, too.
It is hard. It's hard to have an innocent client get convicted.
Prosecutors say they're glad that justice was served.
This case took 37 years to finally be resolved. Are you satisfied that we know the truth about what happened to Debe Atrops?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no other people, no other suspects, no one else with the motive. We feel absolutely 100% sure that he's the one who committed this crime.
Prosecutors are confident the investigation proved the other men in Debe's life, including Jeff Freeberg, were not involved in her murder. Freeberg declined our request to comment on the case.
There just really wasn't any information that pointed in the direction of Jeff Freeberg. He gave his DNA freely. There really just wasn't any motive evidence or anything else that caused him to be a significant suspect.
And they say John Pearson's suicide was an unrelated tragedy.
He had an open criminal case. I believe he thought they were there to arrest him for this misdemeanor warrant and took his life.
There's quite a bit of investigation that was done by our detective after he committed suicide to show it had nothing to do with a guilt for Debe's murder.
When 48 Hours reached out in 2025, Pearson's lawyer declined to comment on the case. Prosecutors say Pearson's family told them he had wanted to testify at Bob's trial.
I thought that it would be important for him to relay all the things he knew, including those statements that Debe made back in 1988, that Bob's going to kill me if he finds out about us.
As for the defense's argument that Debe had a history of making up stories, prosecutors say this is unfortunately consistent with life inside an abusive relationship.
When someone's going through a domestic violence situation, they are, in a way, living a lie.
Bob's side of the courtroom was full. Did that strike you as interesting?
It depends on the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had a large support system, and it's not uncommon for people in a domestic abuse situation to kind of go unknown as a DV abuser. And I think Bob was good at that. I mean, he was a salesman.
After all these years, Darlene Lufkin says she thinks the jury got it right.
I had my suspicions all along.
You believed that that was the right verdict?
I do. I just feel that the question's been answered now.
At her father's sentencing in July 2025, Rihanna Stevens made an emotional appeal for leniency.
When I was 8 months old, someone robbed me of getting to have a life with my mom, there to support my every milestone. 36 years later, I'm being robbed of my father. The man that was there for all of those milestones. I need him in my life.
Attorney Poland read a letter from Bob Atrops' current wife, who has been married to him since 2011.
My husband has always been a devoted and loving father to his daughter.
Despite these appeals, the judge sentenced Robert Atrops to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
You lost your mom at a young age, and you said now you grieve your dad, who is still alive. How do you make sense of what's happening?
I can't make sense of what's happening. I just have to live through it and keep fighting.
She truly loved Rihanna.
What do you want people to know about your friend Debbie?
That she didn't deserve this. She was alive, they should still be here.
Do you think about your mother now?
I do think about her. I wonder what life would have been like had I gotten to live my whole life, grow up having my mom.
Welcome back to Post Mortem. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Green, and joining me today is 48 Hours correspondent Natalie Morales. We are going to discuss the case of Debe Atrops. Now, back in 1988, the young mother was found strangled to death in the trunk of her car in Oregon. For decades, her murder remained unsolved, and it would take 37 years to bring her killer to justice. Joining me now is Natalie.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Good to be with you.
Hey, Natalie, it's always good to be with you. This is one of those hours that I just kind of went back and forth. I was so convinced that they had the right suspect and then they had the wrong suspect. I was ping-ponging.
I think even for me, as I was reporting on this case, I was very conflicted. Even our producers, we were conflicted. But this case was cold for over 30 years. So really, it was all about figuring out what new evidence could be presented at trial.
If you haven't listened to the 48 Hours episode yet, you can find the full audio version just below this episode in your podcast feed. Go take a listen and then come on back for the conversation. Debe Atrops was last seen alive on Tuesday, November 29th, 1988. Her husband, Bob Atrops, first reported her missing to Oregon police when he said she never arrived to pick up their baby daughter, Rihanna, from Bob's house. So I should point out that Bob and her, they are estranged, right? So they have been separated. But Bob calls the police like pretty quickly after he felt that she should have been picking up their daughter. He tells them that Debbie was running about 3 hours late from a hairdressing appointment. So to me, this was like the first indication, like very early on, I thought, oh yeah, he's the one, because it just seemed like 3 hours was too soon to be calling the police. And at least in the portion of the 911 call that we heard, it's not like he said, I've been everywhere. I went to her apartment. I called a hairdresser. Like, it just, something about the 911 call seemed off.
Yeah, all valid points, Anne-Marie. And actually it really wasn't even 3 hours because her appointment ended at 7:15. She was expected back at Bob Atrops' house around 7:30, 8 o'clock. So he's calling really less than 2 hours after that time frame. And police, Detective O'Connell, I should say, who was one of the initial people who was on this case, he said that felt strange to him, too. It's sort of that Shakespearean, that quote, thou doth protest too much. And prosecutors believe those phone calls were almost to try to make police believe that he wasn't involved.
Interesting. Now, he does say back in 1988, he tells police that he called other people. He says he called the babysitter, called Debbie's boss and her parents from his home phone. But the problem with that is that it couldn't be confirmed because there was no record of these phone calls on his home phone. And they were long distance, so they should have been a record someplace.
Yeah, and I should remind people, this is 1988. This is Oregon. So calling from one town to the other town, that could sometimes be a long distance call. Bob lived about 30 miles from where Debbie's parents lived. So all these phone calls should have been recorded somewhere as long distance calls on a phone bill. So it became a big part of the mystery was, where are these calls? Now, we know that he did place these calls because Debbie's parents did confirm, and her stepfather confirmed that they received the calls. The babysitter confirmed that she received a call. So the question is, where did he make the calls from? Investigators believe that Bob maybe had committed the murder and was just trying to get rid of the car and dispose of Debbie's body. And that's when he made those calls as he was out and about.
Were they looking for, I don't know, public telephone, like telephone booths or whatever?
They actually went around and looked at all the public payphones that they could find. They tried to get phone records off the payphones. But that said, you can't go around and trace and track every payphone in the neighborhood. I should also say the one phone call that Bob didn't make, which was very telling to investigators, was he didn't try to call Debbie's house. Now, remember, they're estranged. So she has an apartment in Salem, Oregon, and he never even calls the apartment and never goes to the apartment either to try to see if she ended up deciding to go straight home. So that was very telling to investigators. Bob Atrops explained that away as saying, well, I had already called Debbie's parents and they said she had not gone home.
Okay, so, sadly, Debbie is not a missing person for very long. Less than 2 days later, police discovered her abandoned car near a construction site. And then inside, they discovered Debbie's body face down in the trunk of her car. She had been strangled, but no signs of sexual assault. So at this point, I would think the only person to look at would be Bob. Did police zero in on him as a suspect right away?
Obviously, as we have reported all too often, the partner or the spouse, or in this case, the estranged spouse, is definitely the first person they consider and they look at. And they did search outside Bob's house. They, in fact, checked his driveway, which was a gravel and muddy sort of driveway. They took pictures of that driveway. They even took a mud sample of the driveway and the lawn as well, because on the top of the car, the hood of the car, it appeared there had been some mud evidence that had been wiped away. On Debe Atrops' body, on her coat, they found mud on her shoes. They were muddied as well. So they were trying to match the sample of mud specifically, and also trying to verify the tire tracks. Now, they never could verify her tire tracks on his driveway. A lot of people, a lot of friends were visiting in the time that he reported Debbie missing. Obviously, a lot of people very concerned about Debbie. So police were never able to definitively say whether or not Debbie had come back to the house based on tire tracks.
So then let's talk about their relationship. We know they're estranged, but do we know anything about the nature of their relationship at the time that she goes missing?
She was living, as I said, in this whole other apartment. She was also involved in an entirely new relationship with a man named John Pearson. Friends said that Debbie was very afraid of Bob finding out that she was already dating this guy, John Pearson, was somebody she worked with. And Bob apparently knew her boss. They were good friends. So it wouldn't be, too crazy for him to find out. But Debbie's friend, Tammy Nelson, also said back in 1988 that Bob Atrops had a temper, that he had actually had choked her, according to Debbie, shortly before she moved out. And, she had even told friends, if something happens to me, Bob did it.
Yeah, those are definitely some famous last words. But she is dating this other person, John Pearson, which is what started me when I was watching The Hour, moving away from Bob as a suspect. He was interviewed by police. He told police that he had been with his estranged wife and children on the night of Debbie's disappearance. But he also gave a really detailed description of Debbie's car and what was in the trunk. And it just, I know I can't even tell you really what's in my trunk right now. So it just seems like an odd amount of detail to remember, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very detailed description of what was in the trunk. John told police even, how could a body even fit in the trunk, which kind of
Who
strange
thinks like that?
words to say. He thought the trunk was too small. And so I asked the prosecutors, Allison Brown and Chris Luman, about that. Take a listen. John Pearson told police back then that there was a Burger King bag, as well as a box with cranberries and a child car seat. It seems like a lot of details about the car. I mean, that's not details that I don't think my husband knows what's in my car. That seems like somebody who's very intimately involved with knowing what's in the contents of that vehicle.
Well, and I think we knew that Mr. Pearson had been with her. I mean, he admitted that he'd been with her. They had been dating and was in that car frequently. And then I think his surprise at how could the body fit in the trunk. I mean, as we mentioned, it was delicately placed in there. It is not a large trunk, and that had to have taken some effort to sort of get Debbie's body in the trunk.
Does it seem like an odd commentary, though?
Yeah. I mean, I think they asked him specific questions about the car and its condition, and they were seeing each other every day. I mean, not only were they in a romantic relationship, they both worked at Wellens, so they would often have lunch together. I think they had lunch together the day prior. And so, he would see her often.
Detective O'Connell, who interviewed Pearson back in 1988, said that Pearson was actually very forthcoming when he was questioned. He agreed to many interviews, in fact, and that he even took a polygraph. He passed the polygraph. So Detective O'Connell felt like it wasn't like Pearson was trying to hide anything at the time.
Okay. And at the time, there's still some question marks about Bob, but there's really no evidence connecting Bob or anyone else to Debbie's murder. So the case goes cold, right? Meanwhile, Bob continues to live life. He raises the couple's daughter, Rihanna. She's in her late 30s right now. You spoke to her. She describes him as a great dad. He's doting and attentive, and he's a fantastic grandfather to her 3 children. She does not believe that he had anything to do with her mother's murder.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking speaking with her, of course, because here's a young woman who never even knew her mother. She was 8 months old when her mother died. So she feels that loss still very greatly in her life. And then now she said she feels like she's lost the only person that she feels she could count on her entire life. And that was her father who raised her. And she does feel like he is 100% innocent.
Well, decades after Debbie's murder, detectives and prosecutors with the cold case unit start looking at Bob Atrops again. And we have seen this before, Natalie. Sometimes it's the same evidence, but with fresh eyes, and they see things completely different.
Fresh eyes and new technology. I mean, keep in mind from 1988 now to, 30 plus years later, how much DNA has changed things when it comes to cold cases. There was, Debbie's coat. With that, they take a look at the DNA evidence, and they were able to exclude John Pearson and Jeff Freeberg, who was a former ex, but he was no longer romantically involved with Debbie. However, they couldn't definitively exclude Bob Atrops. Now, the defense points out the amount of DNA that they had was the equivalent of perhaps 6 skin cells, which is a minute amount. So they said this is like the weakest bit of evidence that you could possibly even have. And they said as well, according to the defense, the fact that they shared custody of Rihanna, it's expected that there would be some sort of cross-contamination with DNA. And remember those soil samples that I talked about from the driveway and the evidence that was on the car. So the FBI analyzed the mud that was found on the tire of the car, and also they looked at the soil that was taken from Bob Atrops' lawn, and they said that the mud on the tire was indistinguishable from the mud from Bob's lawn in color, composition, and texture. So that would be a real compelling piece of evidence. In fact, there became this whole part of the trial that was all about the soil evidence. They had soil experts testify. The defense said, though, when it comes down to it, it's soil that is so commonplace in the Willamette Valley that They're like, how could you definitively say that it's Bob Atrops' lawn?
Yeah. And so then detectives do something really interesting. Like one of the holes in Bob's story back then is about these phone calls, right? How come there's no record of these phone calls you say you made? So they re-interview him in 2022 and they ask him again about that night and the phone calls he made. But this time he's got a different story that he didn't tell them the first time around.
Right. So Bob is a salesman. And so at the time he was. So now he's telling detectives, all these years later, well, those phone calls weren't there because I used an MCI calling card to make those calls. And the prosecutors are like, no, that just doesn't add up. Because when you make a call using these calling cards, then you have to punch in this code, this 16-digit code. It just didn't sound like the act of a frantic husband who's calling 911, but then also is he like sitting there punching in the code to just try to make these calls? It just didn't add up to the prosecutors.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
The defense, however, presented somebody at the trial who said that the equipment could have been faulty at the time, and it didn't necessarily record all the calls that came through in the area.
Okay. But ultimately, detectives do arrest him, right? He's arrested in March of 2023 for Debbie's murder. What about the other suspects, though? Because I got to tell you, when I was watching, yes, initially the phone call troubled me. But later on, I thought, well, what about John? I mean, there are other people.
Yeah. Jeff Freeberg, I think, Detective O'Connell, they pretty much figured he was not a person of interest. Also back from the lab, the DNA evidence, the mixture from the coat, from Debe Atrops' coat, excluded John Pearson. However, what was interesting about John Pearson, he had apparently moved to Arizona and was living in a trailer when 5 days before Bob Atrops' trial, 2 police officers show up outside the trailer. They are out there. They're saying, we're here. We want to talk to you. John Pearson looks out the window, sees them, and then kills himself.
See, for me, that was, I thought, wait a minute, why would you do that, right? What are you trying to hide?
Right. According to the prosecution, he had a DUI, apparently, that he was wanted in court for. Take a listen.
He had an open criminal case. I believe he thought they were there to arrest him for this misdemeanor warrant and took his life.
The prosecution also noted his family said he wanted to testify against Bob Atrops. We don't really know what was going on in his mind at the time, but investigators and the prosecutors truly believe there is no evidence that points to John Pearson in this case, that all the evidence squarely pointed at Bob Atrops.
So when Bob is arrested, though, his daughter, Rihanna, is completely blindsided.
Yeah, Rihanna, she's just been so upset at the entire process. She said, she got a call at 5 a.m. that morning telling her that her father, Bob Atrops, had been arrested. Beyond that, she says that at trial, they kept calling her Rihanna instead of Rihanna, which is how her name is pronounced. She was never given a victim's advocate, whereas Debbie's brother and stepfather had a victim's advocate at their side. Here's a little bit more of what she had to say.
The prosecution stood there in trial and made me out to be the most important thing in my mom's life. I'm her baby, her daughter. But the prosecution never treated me as such.
So I asked the prosecutors about that. I asked them point blank, how did they feel about how they treated her? And here's what they had to say.
And during the trial, Rihanna told us that she was not contacted by a victim's advocate from your office, even though, here it is, it's her mother who was murdered. Why not?
We had the indication that she didn't want to have any contact with us. That she was on the defendant's side and that wasn't interested in being part of our case or having contact with the prosecution. That was my understanding.
She also said that she was not informed ahead of time when the autopsy photos were going to be shown in court on the day during the trial. Meanwhile, Debbie's brother had been informed ahead of time and he left the courtroom because he knew it would be too hard to see. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I can't imagine how that would feel. again, her not having contact with our office, it's difficult for us to sort of alert everybody in the courtroom, here's what we're about to do. And certainly that was not intentional.
Yeah, sometimes it's the nature of the system that, if you're not a defendant and you're not a witness, then it's like you don't have a role.
Right. And that's how she feels. She feels that she got lost in the process, but also that they excluded her because they knew she was on her father's side and she was going to defend him all the way.
So then what sort of evidence did the prosecution have? What sort of evidence did they present that connected Bob to this crime?
Perhaps the most compelling part of evidence, according to the prosecution, was the alleged pattern of domestic abuse in their relationship. Debbie's mother had told police at the time of the murder that Bob Atrops was verbally, physically abusive and very controlling, that she immediately suspected that Bob was the killer. And as we mentioned earlier, her friend Tammy Nelson testified that Debbie told Tammy that he had choked her before. I mean, that right there is evidence. Tammy also told the defense team that Debbie told her that she was scared of Bob, especially when they had to hand off Rihanna. That's when those moments, those confrontations could happen. And that's exactly what prosecutors believe is what happened. When Debbie went to the house that night, he had found out about her relationship with John Pearson, and that set it up for that night, for this confrontation, and for him to then, in a fit of rage, strangle Debe Atrops.
Mm-hmm.
The defense argued, however, that Debbie's stories were unreliable.
We hear this version of Bob, but at trial, there were a lot of people that were there supporting him, not just his daughter.
Yes, he had a lot of support, including his fourth wife was there. He's, been married since 2011. He did have 2 other marriages and divorces after Debbie's murder. But as Chris Luman, the assistant prosecutor, said, that he can be charming and he knows how to get his way and how to have people, believe him.
So ultimately, though, the jury does find him guilty of murdering Debe Atrops. The defense was rather emotional, and you don't see that very often.
Yeah. In fact, defense attorney April Yates was very emotional. She said that Bob Atrops is an innocent person who has been convicted.
Of course, Rihanna is now a victim twice over. That's the way she feels. She mentioned that to you. She never got to know her mother, and now she's also lost her father. And she gave a really powerful statement at his sentencing. I'm curious about the reaction when she read that statement.
It was a moment that I felt was very, very telling. Rihanna is there. She's pleading with the judge to, spare her father, to be more lenient in his sentencing, telling the judge that she and her 3 kids, they need their father and grandfather. Bob, at that point, he hardly ever looks in her direction and hardly ever looks up from the table. Now, the question is he so racked with guilt? Or is this somebody, who's just being stoic and having to deal with, this verdict and now the sentencing? It's hard to say how you would interpret it. I think it's up to the viewer's interpretation here. But as a parent, if that was my child saying, I need my parent, I just can't imagine not being emotional in that moment.
Absolutely. Bob Atrops received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years. If he is to be released, he would be 93 years old at the time. How is Rihanna grappling with this?
She says she's trying to be strong and she's trying to keep up the fight, but she's very upset. And really at the heart of all of this is truly a tragic love story. It's so clear when you see from the very first frames of the home video, after adopting Rihanna, how much Debe Atrops bonded with that baby. That love just screams through the screen, and you can't help but think all that was lost. And Rihanna says she feels that loss every day. And now, of course, she's dealing with having, to lose her father in the process as well. Yeah. So it's a tragic story all around.
Absolutely. Decades waiting for some sort of justice. And then there are other people involved who think there's no justice at all. But ultimately, my heart breaks for Rihanna and everything that she has lost.
Yes, I mean, she's a strong person, and, you know, fortunately she has a lot of people who are supporting her through this.
Yeah, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you.
And if you like this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.